Turn right onto Dover Road. Continue for 1.5 miles. In 300 yards, keep right to continue towards Tons Lane, A355. Keep right. In a quarter of a mile, at the roundabout, take the first exit onto the M4 slip road to London, Heathrow Airport. In a quarter of a mile, merge onto M4. Continue on M4 for 9 miles.
Independence and transparency, because there have been too many questions about the whole sorry affair, and I think we need some clarity, and we need it quickly from Downing Street. Plans are being drawn up to try to keep passenger and freight trains running after unions warned of potentially the biggest rail strike in history. The RMT says the action is being taken over pay, compulsory redundancies and safety concerns. The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps will meet the Prime Minister and Chancellor next week to discuss the matter. And pharmacists will have greater freedoms to choose alternative HRT products if the original prescription is out of stock. The government's supply task force, which was set up to tackle widespread shortages, has agreed to give pharmacists more control, something they have been demanding. LBC weather, a bright start for many. Cloud will thicken throughout the morning, scattered showers for the north and west, and a high of 20 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Lottie Morley.
Right now at B&Q, get 25% off garden furniture, barbecues and outdoor play. That's 25% off, making the most of summer. So bring on the sunshine. Shop in-store at DIY.com or on the B&Q app. You can do it. Excludes products sold and shipped by verified sellers online, subject to availability and 6th of June.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Matthew Wright.
Yes, indeed, it's my pleasure to sit in for Andrew Castle this weekend. Apologies for my voice. I had no voice at all on Thursday, a little bit more today, so I suspect there's going to be a few pipes and squeaks over the next few hours. Hope you love all that I serve up for you this morning. We can always have a rematch tomorrow. And I'm going to kick off with Partygate, mindful of some of the calls that Ian was just handling. If the Tories hoped the end of the Partygate investigations would mean everything gets back to normal, whatever that means when you're dealing with a slew of different sex assault allegations in Parliament, then I'd imagine the Tories must be pretty disappointed with the headlines over the last 48 hours. The Daily Mail yesterday told its readers that Boris Johnson escaped censure after a costly, wasteful police investigation. But he didn't, did he? He got fined, albeit only once. And if it was a waste of money investigating the most fined address in the country with regards to COVID, then what on earth was the Mail doing calling for a police investigation into Keir Starmer every day on their front page for what felt like half a lifetime? What do we know? Well, we know 83 different individuals got hit with Partygate fines, 126 handed out in all. I believe one individual got as many as 5. We're also told that the majority of recipients are young, female, poorly paid and angry. And they can't understand why they've been nicked for partying, but their boss, the PM Boris Johnson, didn't, even when he was at the same illegal gatherings, one at his own home, allegedly pouring wine. Perhaps because the police only investigated his presence at 2 of the 6 parties they were looking at, or so says the Mirror. Dominic Raab yesterday lent his boss another hand, doing rounds on TV and radio saying any ministers who received an FPN should be named and shamed. But then we've got on the story today is whether the civil servants who are at the party should be named and shamed. We're going to get onto that in just a moment. There's also the Sue Gray report, delayed for so long it's starting to whiff a tad. We're told we could see it as early as next week. We've also just found out the man who holds the highest office in the land, it looks like he's been given advance warning that he's one of 30 people to face criticism from Gray in that report. But the papers, I suspect, the right-leaning papers anyway, would rather us focus on the civil servants who got fined partying with the Prime Minister. Should they be named and shamed? Well, should they? It's not standard practice. I mean, we don't know the identities of most of the 120,000 odd folk who also copped a COVID party fine over the lockdown period. So should these civil servants be named and shamed? Well, I'm going to turn first for guidance to an old colleague of mine from my days on The Sun, David Woodick, political editor of The Sun on Sunday. Good morning to you, David.
Morning, Matthew.
Lovely talking to you. I do apologise.
Down the line.
I can hear. Well, we can only do our best, sir. Let's start off with the first question here. Should these civil servants be named and shamed?
Certainly not if they're young people, junior people who are doing their job, and they get caught up in this political scandal. Then no. I mean,
sorry, just by doing their job, you mean that they were working and then found themselves perhaps pressed into going to a party?
Yes. I mean, we'll find out when we read the full details in the Sue Gray report, but we're led to believe that some WhatsApp messages will be published in this report, which shows that there was some undue pressure on more junior members of staff to attend some of these gatherings. Now, if that's the case, they will rightly feel a little bit hard done to if their bosses were leaning on them to turn up at these events. They get a fine, which they can afford less than their senior supervisors, and then get named and shamed in public. I mean, the bottom line with this, and this has been the difficulty all along, Matthew, is the police have tried to treat this like any other event, and said that they will not be treated any differently. Now, if that's the case, nobody who is fined will be named, because if you or I were to pick up a fine, it would end up in the newspapers and on the radio and TV. So that maybe should be the case then. The problem is with this, it's a political scandal. The police were asked to get involved, mostly by the Labour Party, who were trying to land on the Prime Minister, and then as a result of that, all these people get caught up in it. And if you're saying we want full transparency, we want to find out the facts of precisely what went on there, then I'm afraid all the facts have to come out, and sometimes that can involve names being published.
So, I started my introduction, if the Tories hoped the end of the Partygate investigations would mean everything could get back to normal, but from where we are right now at this moment in time, I would suggest that the wound of Partygate is still open, sore and festering.
Yeah, absolutely, because there's suggestions that some of there's about 30 people who are going to be referred to in the report, probably about 15 of them named specifically, and some of those are pushing back and saying, hang on, I want to call my lawyers in here, I don't want to be named, and that could delay the whole publication of the report. In fact, some people will take exception with the way it's been reported, even if they're not named, in which case that could delay publication of the report. And this, for the Prime Minister, is the last thing he wants, because this has been dragging on for 5 months as it is.
So who is to blame for this situation getting for it not being tied off, for it not being dealt with? Who's to blame for it continuing to fester?
Gosh, that is a difficult question, Matthew. I mean, it's a can of worms that has been opened, I'm afraid. Yes, for political reasons, a story was out there saying that the Prime Minister was involved in some illegal gatherings during lockdown. Labour and some Labour-supporting newspapers pushed hard for action on that. The police didn't want to get involved. Finally, they bent to that political pressure, and now we've seen, as a result of that, Durham police have been under pressure from the Conservatives to get involved, and they are now investigating Keir Starmer. So, it's one of those things where police have been...
In 2 miles, at junction 3, take the A312 exit to Harrow, Hayes.
Is going to be political. If we look at the Keir Starmer situation, for instance, if they issue a fine against him, they know he will have to resign.
Yes.
Because he said he will.
Yes.
So how can that not be politics not coming to their decision?
Mind you, if you go down that route, you can look at the ministerial code, which would expect anybody who misleads Parliament to resign as well. But we can live in hope on that score.
Yes, exactly.
David, I'm going to let you go and hope your voice, which sounds a tad worse than mine, recovers over the weekend. Lovely talking to you. Now, David raised a really interesting point during that conversation about junior members of the civil service who may have found themselves pressed, pushed, coerced perhaps into attending parties for fear that if they didn't, it might damage their employment situation. They would be seen as not part of the team. Should these people, so we're hearing that most of the people that have received fines are at the younger end of the spectrum, they're female and they're angry because they see their more superior, better off bosses not being held to account. Is this fair? Is this perhaps one of the reasons that Partygate continues to sort of rumble on? I thought we needed some legal perspective, and Beverly Sunderland, or later to say, is joining us now, Managing Director at Crossland Employment Solicitors. Good morning, Beverly.
Good morning, Matthew. I'm pleased to say that my voice hopefully is not too crackly this morning.
Well, let's hope it stays that way while we're on air. Do you have any sympathy for these arguments, that there are arguments being played out in newspapers and over the radio now, that junior members of staff in the civil service seem to have been unfairly punished for these parties?
Absolutely, a great deal of sympathy. I mean, we all know that actually if you get a job in 10 Downing Street, then that is going to open various doors for you going forward, because it's going to look great on the CV, but that doesn't mean...
In a 1/4 mile, at junction 3, take the A312 exit to Harrow, Hayes.
Frankly, as you say, they were doing it, I'm absolutely sure, most of them, because of peer pressure, because they felt that they needed to fit in, and and now they find themselves on the end of fines.
Exit at junction 3.
A report that's going to be published by Sue Gray.
Do you find the naming, is that a sort of critical point in this proceedings, that if she was to proceed...
In a 1/4 mile, at Cranford Parkway interchange, take the 4th exit onto the Parkway, A312.
Legal action, such like David Wooding alluded to just a few minutes ago?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, these people, men and women, are ultimately employees. And as employees, the moment you've been employed for more than 2 years, then you have rights not to be unfairly dismissed. And that includes this mythical beast that we all hear about called constructive dismissal. And that's where your employer does something to you that makes it untenable. I mean, it comes in lots of forms, but that's the main one, that all trust and confidence breaks down. Now, of course, the employer might say, well, hang on a minute, it's not our fault. Sue Gray has produced this report, it's nothing to do with us. But as a young junior employee, you'd be saying, well, why aren't you just putting your hand up and saying, actually, I was there, I persuaded, I forced, I coerced everybody to come along, and actually I should be taking all the stick for this and not younger, junior, primarily female, we understand, employees, and that is open to them. But, I mean, it's career suicide for them, isn't it?
Well,
Catch-22.
Well, that leads on to my next question, really, which is, what do you expect...
Exit the roundabout onto the Parkway.
...the disgruntled and the disenfranchised among them to do? Because it would strike me that if they make any moves, whether they complain or whatever...
Continue on the Parkway for 1 mile.
That is potentially going to further damage their career prospects, so that they are in a catch-22 moving forward.
That's absolutely right. And indeed, I mean, that applies not only to this situation, but to a lot of employees in a lot of niche sectors, shall we say. But I think that what we'll start to see is the leaking of more messages and information, which will be further to the detriment, if that is at all possible, to the Conservative Party. And I think that's the problem, is that they're not going to say anything too public. They will just do the damage where they know that it will hurt, and it's going to be a real problem for them.
Young people pressured into going to parties. This is one of our listeners. You're having a laugh. Do you think we're all gullible? He made me attend a drunken party. Are you crazy? I think this listener doesn't understand the power imbalance that we're talking about within Westminster.
Absolutely. And I know it does sound really strange to say that you're being pressurised, but let's just wind back. We were in the middle of lockdown. None of their family and friends were having parties. They are there working for the Prime Minister and the most senior politicians of this country. And they would have been frightened about catching COVID. If they are told, listen, you need to come along, we need to celebrate. If you're not there, then what do you think other people will be thinking of you? Then you're jolly well going to come and be frightened of catching COVID and be frightened that your job isn't going to be no more and you're not going to climb up a sort of greasy pole or whatever we call it these days.
Beverly Sunderland, I'm very grateful for you for setting out your stall, the perspective there of Solicitor Crossland Employment Solicitors. I'm still left...
In a quarter of a mile, at Wagoners Roundabout, take the second exit and stay on the Parkway, A312.
Illustrious nation found breaking the law. That, to me, is the beginning, the middle and the end of the Partygate story. And I find it fascinating that as Partygate progresses, we take in different angles. And the angle in all the right-wing papers today is about civil servants. And I'm left here thinking, okay, am I reading this right? What we're seeing here is that while I think the real story is Boris Johnson, we're being told it's actually a civil service issue. But I'm thinking, aren't these civil servants being hung out to dry, perhaps? There certainly seems to be a lot of animosity coming from certain members of Boris Johnson's cabinet.
Exit the roundabout onto the Parkway.
Towards the civil service.
Continue on A312 for 1.5 miles.
UK in a changing Europe. Worked in Whitehall and in number 10 as a senior civil servant, presumably, Jill, in the days before Partygate.
That's a long time.
Good morning.
Partygate.
Good morning. What is happening? It does strike me that there is a growing tension between government and the civil servants, and Partygate is not going to help.
It's clearly not helping. I mean, it was always, I think, a mistake to effectively ask a senior civil servant, however much integrity, however, in inverted commas, independent you might present it, to investigate and to do an investigation that could ultimately have serious implications for the Prime Minister's future. So I always thought it's a mistake for the Cabinet Secretary to agree that the civil service, rather than someone outside, would do the investigation.
Yes,
see that coming to a head.
Yes.
I do think that, the civil service has quite a lot of questions to answer about how it let this culture that Sue Gray identified in her earlier report to take hold, but I also think that ministers have a lot to answer for as well, because if you knew ministers were deeply disapproving of having parties, even if they weren't attending, then you wouldn't be having them, because ministers and civil servants, certainly at the centre of government, work incredibly closely together and need to work incredibly closely together. That's how the system can work.
Do we need to know which civil servants have received FPNs and which haven't? Is that key?
No, I don't think that is key, actually. I don't think a list of sort of lots and lots of sort of junior people that we've never heard of is particularly important. And I think for the various reasons you were just talking about, it's quite important that, those who just dropped in, just turned up, don't really have much further action taken. What I do think is important is that we know who instigated these events, and in particular who gave permission to them, who were the senior people who said this is all okay. And I think that's where we'll be looking to Sue Gray's report. Sue's initial report said that there were serious failures of judgment and leadership in number 10 in the Cabinet Office. The Met Police process has shown